In the shadowy corridors of human history, there are names that echo with such depravity, such raw and unfiltered horror, that they seem less like men and more like myths carved from nightmares. One such name is Caligula, a name that, even after nearly 2 millennia, still conjures images of unhinged cruelty, divine delusion, and the terrifying consequences of absolute power in the hands of the unstable. Caligula was not simply a tyrant. He was a descent, made fleshy a cautionary tale of what happens when a man is raised in blood, ascends by betrayal, and rules with unchecked madness. This is not merely a biography, it is a forbidden history, a narrative that ancient Rome tried desperately to bury under the weight of silence. For what happened during those 4 years of his rule was so disturbing, so corrosive to the soul of the empire, that even the most hardened chroniclers of Roman brutality hesitated to speak his name aloud. The year was 37 AD. Rome stood as the jewel of the known world, an empire whose borders stretched from the wind-swept coasts of Britain to the golden deserts of Egypt, from the sun-scorched hills of Spain to the ancient cities of Syria. Its legions were unmatched, its wealth vast, and its political machine deeply entrenched in layers of tradition, corruption, and ambition. Into this world stepped a 24-year-old prince named Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus, Germanicus, known to soldiers and citizens alike by a childhood nickname, Caligula, meaning little boots. At first glance, his rise was the answer to Rome's prayers. The Senate, weary of the gloom and terror that had defined the reign of Tiberius, welcomed this charismatic young man with a collective sigh of relief. He was the son of Germanicus, a beloved general who had died under suspicious circumstances. The people saw in him a reincarnation of virtue, a beacon of hope after years of paranoia, purges, and silent executions. But what they could not see was the storm gathering beneath that youthful face, a tempest forged by trauma, sharpened by bloodshed, and soon to be unleashed upon the world. Caligula's childhood was a crucible of trauma and fear, born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty. His lineage traced directly back to Augustus himself, the architect of the Roman Empire. His great-grandfather had risen through calculated political brutality. His grandfather, Tiberius, ruled not with inspiration, but with dread, and his father, Germanicus, despite his popularity, met an early and mysterious death, possibly poisoned, a fate not uncommon in the halls of imperial Rome. As a child, Caligula lived among legions, dressing in miniature armor, adored by the soldiers who called him Little Boots. But those early memories of admiration were soon replaced by the systematic destruction of his family. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was accused of treason, exiled, and starved to death. His brothers, Nero and Drusus, were imprisoned and executed, their names erased from public memory. Caligula survived not by cunning, but by appearing harmless and eccentric, theatrical young man who posed no threat. Tiberius, ever the paranoiac, once remarked that he was raising a viper for the Roman people. Time would reveal just how right he was. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, some say suffocated by Caligula, himself, the young heir, assumed power over the greatest empire in the world, and at first it appeared Rome had been reborn. Caligula showered the Praetorian Guard and other military units with bonuses, securing their loyalty with vast sums of imperial gold. He released political prisoners, recalled exiles, and perhaps, most surprisingly, published the imperial budget for public review, a move unseen since Augustus. These acts earned him immediate popularity among both the elite and the masses. Rome, a city bruised by the cold tyranny of Tiberius, embraced Caligula with a fervor that bordered on worship. His arrival was seen as divine intervention, his voice hailed as the voice of the gods. The people cheered as he hosted magnificent games, chariot races, and public festivals. He spared no expense in pleasing the crowd. Amphitheaters overflowed with exotic beasts, dragged from every corner of the empire, pitted against each other in brutal displays. Gladiators, trained killers hardened by years of bloodshed, fought from dawn till dusk to entertain an emperor, who sat above them laughing not with delight, but with something far darker. Behind the gold-laced public appearances and grand proclamations, however, was a man unraveling. The generosity was a mask. The games were a distraction, and the smiles, forced and wide, concealed a mind rapidly spiraling into delusion and depravity. Caligula did not simply tolerate violence, he bathed in it. He found genuine pleasure in the suffering of others. What the people once saw as a generous ruler, they soon came to fear as a man who played God, not in theory, but in practice. His fascination with death was not political, it was personal. Every spectacle of blood, every execution ordered on a whim, was not a tool for power, but a performance for his own pleasure. What began as entertainment for the masses soon devolved into madness on a scale the empire had never seen. And this was only the beginning. During the early months of his reign, Caligula was a picture of potential. In what many historians call the honeymoon period, the young emperor completed several of Tiberius's unfinished construction projects and launched new public works that provided employment to thousands. He restored the ancient theater of Pompey and even commissioned a new amphitheater grand, tributes to Roman engineering that veiled the shadows beginning to take root within his mind. Foreign envoys reported that the new emperor appeared intelligent and articulate, handling diplomatic affairs with a surprising deftness for someone so young and inexperienced. Yet even then, something seemed off to those who paid close attention. His laughter during the gladiator games rang out too loudly, too sincerely, long after the cheering crowds had fallen silent. His eyes would trace the flow of blood across the arena sand, and whispers swirled through the palace halls, rumors that he would sneak back into the empty amphitheater at night, pacing alone where men had died only hours before. The seeds of madness were already there, nourished by the intoxicating wine of unchecked power. Then, just 8 months into his reign, Caligula fell mysteriously ill. Whatever the condition was, some suggest encephalitis, others suspect temporal lobe epilepsy. Its exact nature remains one of history's great unsolved medical mysteries. What is certain is this: the man who rose from that sickbed was no longer the man who had once been hailed as Rome's savior. It was as if the fever had scorched away the last remnants of his humanity. Suetonius writes that during his illness, the Roman people were so concerned for their beloved ruler that they held vigils outside the palace. Some even offered their lives to the gods in exchange for his recovery. But the gods, it seemed, had a brutal sense of irony. Their first prayer was granted. The second would become a necessity. Once he recovered, those closest to him noticed the change immediately. His voice had taken on a grating, metallic edge, and his eyes radiated an unsettling intensity, as though he wasn't looking at people, but through them he spoke of divine conversations, claiming Jupiter whispered directly to him, and that he saw visions invisible to mortal eyes. These so-called divine revelations would soon serve as justification for the cruelest acts of his reign. The transformation wasn't subtle. Before his illness, Caligula had shown the standard aristocratic detachment toward suffering. Afterward, he became obsessed with inflicting it. He spent hours devising intricate punishments for trivial offenses, savoring both the design and the execution of his cruelty. Historians have long debated whether this marked a psychological break, a form of brain damage that stripped him of empathy while preserving his intellect. The first glaring sign of this mental collapse came in his treatment of his own family. He forced his beloved sister Drusilla to divorce her husband so that she could live with him as his wife, engaging in an incestuous relationship that scandalized even Rome's morally elastic elite. When Drusilla died suddenly in 38 AD, he declared her a goddess. It became a capital offense to question her divinity. Mourning her was mandatory. Laughing, bathing, or dining with one's family during the period of grief could result in execution. Paranoia took hold like a virus. Caligula began to see enemies in every shadow. He forced the respected senator Marcus Junius Silanus to commit suicide, citing nothing more than a threatening dream. From that moment on, any citizen unfortunate enough to appear in Caligula's nightmares could expect a visit from the Praetorian Guard by dawn. His relationship with the Roman Senate unraveled quickly. As his delusions of grandeur swelled, Caligula began appearing in public, dressed as the gods, sometimes as Jupiter, bearing a fake beard and thunderbolt, other times as Neptune, wielding a trident, and even as Venus, in full women's attire and cosmetics. Senators were commanded to approach him on their knees, kissing his feet before speaking. Hesitation was treason. Resistance was suicide. Was seized. Lives destroyed, all to fuel the emperor's spiraling indulgence. Caligula's mood swings were notorious. A dinner party could begin with charming conversation and extravagant entertainment, only to end with the arbitrary execution of a guest. Attendees learned to laugh at every joke and smile at every insult, ever sure if they'd make it to desert. Eventually, the emperor proclaimed himself a living god. Statues of his likeness were erected in temples across the empire, replacing the heads of traditional deities. Citizens were ordered to offer sacrifices in his name. Failing to display sufficient enthusiasm and worship could mean death. In his fevered mind, the line between man and God had been obliterated. As his madness deepened, the palace devolved into a carnival of depravity. Caligula instituted regular orgies where sexual debauchery was fused with brutality. Senators and their wives were forced to participate while he observed from a throne, passing judgment on who would live and who would die. These weren't mere spectacles, they were displays of dominance where human dignity was sacrificed for his amusement. He summoned married women to his chambers and violated them in front of their husbands, rating their performance aloud and comparing their bodies to Rome's most infamous courtesans. Suetonius recounts how he would dine with couples, inspect the wives like livestock, then force their husbands to watch as he defiled them, later describing the acts in grotesque detail over wine and roasted peacock. No one was safe. Sexual appetite extended across every boundary of age, gender, and social class. Young senators were turned into his personal toys. Aristocratic wives and daughters were treated as state-owned pleasure objects. The imperial palace, once the beating heart of Roman power, had become a brothel of horrors. Even his sisters weren't spared. Beyond his incestuous bond with Drusilla, accounts suggest he had sexual relations with Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla. He openly fondled them at public banquets and later used them as political currency, offering them as sexual gifts to foreign dignitaries and Roman elites to demonstrate his total control over the imperial bloodline. His banquets became infamous for fusing opulence with degradation. Guests were forced to take part in increasingly humiliating acts. Senators were stripped naked, compelled to perform with slaves as their peers ate and pretended not to watch. Participation was non-negotiable. Refusal was fatal. In the end, Caligula's Rome was no longer an empire, it was a stage for one man's psychosis, a city trapped beneath the crushing weight of a god-emperor's madness. And as the blood pooled in the marble corridors of his palace, even the gods must have turned their faces away. In the shadow of the Roman Empire, an emperor arose who twisted power into something unrecognizable, an instrument of sacred perversion and unspeakable cruelty. Caligula orchestrated sexual rituals that blurred the lines between religion and depravity, cloaked in the illusion of divine ceremony. These blasphemous rites transformed acts of sexual violence into what he proclaimed were obligations to the gods. Participants weren't merely victims, they were coerced into believing they were taking part in something holy. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of his depravity was reserved for Rome's most innocent. According to ancient sources, did not hesitate to assault the young daughters of Rome's elite, some scarcely older than children, while forcing their parents to watch in silence, and worse, to express gratitude. Their suffering was not accidental, it was deliberate. The innocence of children became another line for him to cross, another symbol of civilization shattered. Beneath his madness, his sadism did not end with the act itself, extended into elaborate systems of punishment, meant to maximize suffering. Condemned men were made to witness their wives and daughters violated before execution, with rape used as a theatrical prelude to death. Women who displeased the emperor met slow, methodical torment. They weren't merely killed, they were broken, their screams echoing through marble halls as a warning to any who dared defy him. Even the gladiatorial arena, long a place of spectacle, was warped under his reign into something darker. Nobles were stripped and thrown into combat, not to fight, but to be humiliated, sexually assaulted by gladiators trained for the task. And when the supply of criminals ran low, Caligula turned on his own people. Spectators were pulled from the crowd, raped, and then thrown to the beasts, as the lines between punishment, entertainment, and ritual murder disappeared entirely. The amphitheater, once a symbol of Roman ingenuity and honor, became a monument to his cruelty where citizens could be violated and executed for the emperor's amusement, but cruelty alone did not sustain his reign. It was funded lavishly by theft on an imperial scale. Within a single year, Caligula drained the immense fortune left by his predecessor. Tiberius some 7 billion sesterces in games, banquets, and construction projects meant to glorify his supposed divinity. When that money vanished, desperation set in, and with it came violence. He revived the infamous treason trials, once used by Tiberius for control, but Caligula's version served a new purpose: profit. Wealthy Romans were accused of fabricated crimes against the emperor's sacred person. Their assets were seized, their homes plundered, and their lives extinguished or exiled. In his Rome, having wealth was no longer a privilege, it was a death sentence. As paranoia consumed him, so did his thirst for more. He levied taxes that bordered on lunacy in marriages, divorces, lawsuits, prostitution, gambling, and even silence. To remain quiet during one of his speeches became a taxable offense. Citizens were forced to pay simply for the right to breathe in his presence. Refusal meant execution. The Roman economy, built over centuries of conquest and commerce, was now being devoured from the inside, consumed by the bottomless appetite of a single man. Perhaps the most bizarre expression of his madness came when Caligula named his favorite horse Sadistic as consul, the highest civilian office in the Republic. The horse lived in a marble stable, ate from an ivory manger, wore garments dyed in imperial purple, and was served by a retinue of slaves. To many, it appeared as mere lunacy. But to the Senate, it was clear this was humiliation by design. By raising an animal above Rome's lawmakers, Caligula made a statement. He believed the Senate to be less than beasts. His megalomania extended even into the realm of engineering. In one legendary project, he ordered the construction of a floating bridge across the Bay of Naples over 3 miles long, not for transport, not for commerce, but so that he could ride across it wearing the armor of Alexander the Great. He claimed this made him greater than the Macedonian conqueror, who had merely walked across the Hellespont. The bridge devoured untold resources and hundreds of lives, then was abandoned. The moment the novelty faded, and this wasn't an isolated indulgence, projects like these sprang up across the empire, vast, illogical monuments to the whims of a mad emperor. Fear governed every interaction. Courtiers moved through their days as if walking through a labyrinth of death, never knowing which word, which glance might trigger the emperor's rage. The staff developed secret codes and gestures to warn each other of his moods, but even then, the precautions often failed, and the madness continued. The Roman military, once the most disciplined and revered force in the ancient world, was slowly unraveling under the weight of one man's madness. That man was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history simply as Caligula. His obsession with divinity didn't stop at temples or public speeches. It extended deep into the ranks of his armies, where he claimed to receive commands, not from generals or advisors, but directly from the gods. Entire legions were ordered to halt so their emperor could speak to invisible deities. Soldiers stood in rigid formation as Caligula mumbled to the empty air, lost in divine delusions. These so-called communions could last for hours, and any soldier who dared show impatience or worse, disbelief was marked for punishment. Military operations ground to a halt. Strategy gave way to spectacle. Logistics collapsed under the weight of a ruler more concerned with prophecy than planning. Nowhere was this clearer than in his infamous campaign to invade Britain. At the last possible moment, Caligula claimed that Neptune, the god of the sea, had forbidden the crossing. Rather than admit retreat, he declared victory without ever setting foot on British soil. Rome was treated to a full triumph, celebrating a conquest that had never occurred. Still, the Roman people clapped. They were afraid not to. By 41 AD, the emperor's reign had descended into pure terror. Even the Praetorian Guard, once the fiercest protectors of the imperial family, had become unwilling. Enforcers of Caligula's bizarre and violent commands, one of them, a senior centurion named Cassius Chaerea, had been singled out for humiliation. Caligula mocked his voice, gave him obscene passwords like Priapus and Venus, and made a mockery of his years of military service. But Chaerea was not alone. Senators, equestrians, even freedmen, people from every class who had endured Caligula's tyranny, joined together, not out of shared politics, but out of a mutual desire to survive. As long as Caligula lived, no one was safe. The final straw came at the Palatine Games in January of 41 AD. There, Caligula announced his plan to move to Alexandria and rule as a living godfrey of Rome's traditions. He also spoke openly of massacring the entire Senate and replacing them with animals and favorites, including his horse. For the conspirators, this was the point of no return. Either they acted immediately or watched Rome vanish into madness. The plan was meticulous. They had memorized the emperor's daily routine and identified the narrow underground corridor beneath the palace where he would be most vulnerable. Timing the assassination to the change of the guard, they waited in the shadows. January 24th. Caligula attended the final day of the games. On stage, actors reenacted scenes of murder and betrayal, ironically foreshadowing what was to come. As the emperor left for lunch, he chose the shortcut through the underground passage. It was a fatal decision. Sharia and the conspirators struck fast. The first blow tore through Caligula's neck and jaw. Then came the flurry blow after blow, the bottled-up rage of a city unleashed. According to Suetonius, he died with over 30 wounds each, one a scar left on Rome. His final words, if the sources are to be believed, were chilling. I am still alive. A last, delusional gasp from a man who had once declared himself immortal. What followed was chaos. The Senate didn't rejoice. They panicked. Fearful of retaliation from Caligula's Germanic bodyguards, they scattered. Even the Praetorian Guard was divided, some loyal to the conspirators, others to the imperial family. For hours, the fate of the empire hung in limbo. The conspirators had succeeded in killing the tyrant, but they had no plan for what came next. That plan came unexpectedly, in the form of Claudius Caligula's timid uncle, found trembling behind a curtain. The Praetorians, desperate for stability, proclaimed him emperor. Claudius would go on to restore order and governance to an empire teetering on collapse. The nightmare of Caligula's reign was over, but the psychological wounds he left behind would scar Rome for generations. In the wake of his death, the Roman Senate attempted to erase him from memory. A damnatio memoria was declared. His statues were smashed, inscriptions scratched away, official documents altered to minimize his name. But, ironically, this effort to forget only guaranteed that history would remember to this day. Scholars debate the exact nature of Caligula's madness. Was it epilepsy? Bipolar disorder? Psychopathy worsened by absolute power? The truth may never be known. But one thing is certain, his reign revealed how fragile civilization becomes. And without a soul, the patterns of tyranny that emerged under Caligularly popularity, spiraling paranoia, the erosion of institutions, and the use of fear to rule would repeat throughout history, in emperors, dictators, and despots from every age. And so, the story of Caligula is not just a Roman tragedy, it's a universal warning that evil doesn't always arrive with fire and thunder. Sometimes it creeps in behind the mask of glory. That human dignity must be defended, that laws and institutions are only as strong as the people who uphold them, and that the battle against tyranny is never truly over, because when we forget men like Caligula, we risk meeting them again.